Any questions about anything before we start from you guys? Just as a reminder, 2 weeks from today is the first paper. Um, Again, the default topic on that is westward expansion, but you can do pretty much whatever else as long as it's within our course material. The second paper is going to be on chapter 19, I believe, so I guess don't go up past that. So yeah, if you got any questions about that, you can let me know, email me, or ask me in class, whatever you need. So, and again, those of you in here, if you could print them out and bring them in, that'd be great. Those online obviously don't do that. Email them to me, and when you email them to me, make sure that they are a, let's see, okay. Make sure that they are attached as a Word or PDF document, not like a Google Doc or Google Drive link, because Francis Marion email doesn't like that, and it will block the email. So don't do that. Okay. Morning. All right. Other than that, we can start the next chapter, which is, it's kind of a companion piece to the previous chapter, to chapter 16. But this is more about the workers than the businessmen, although we do talk quite a bit about the clash between them. So, well, we'll get into it. I don't need to over-explain. So, as we saw with the previous chapters, the big businesses had begun organizing and becoming more powerful in the industrial era. So workers also saw that they needed to industrialize, to organize in order to be able to fight back. Security decent wages, they formed labor unions, political parties, had a various series of collective actions they would perform, one of which is the strike, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. However, because again this is still the late 1800s, these organizations were filled with all sorts of internal conflicts, occupational status, race, ethnicity, and gender, so they had a hard time forming lasting, powerful organizations that stood up against the corporations and federal government that were working against them. Also, the workplace itself was industrialized. As I've mentioned to you guys before, prior to the Industrial Revolution, everyone worked on a farm. If you weren't working on a farm, you were transporting stuff that was from a farm. If you were somebody that worked in a shipyard, that was just transportation. So with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, 1870, for example, a few factories employed more than 500 workers, because again, typically people worked for themselves. But as things become more organized, by 1900 there were 1,500 companies that had workforces either at 500 or greater. And the book mentions a series of companies. General Electric, which we talked about, International Harvester, which was McCormick's company. It was the, I'll show an image of the harvester here in a moment. Morning. Pullman Palace Car Company, which I've also talked about. U.S. Steel, which is Carnegie. And then another just example here. So at the start of what we're talking about, 1865, manufacturing had about 5.3 million workers, and by 1900 it had almost tripled to about 15.1 million. So most of these workers came from two distinct groups. One was farmers, and farmers being themselves two distinct groups, either white farmers that were unable to make a profit due to various economic issues that were causing land prices to plummet, or former slaves who had been sharecropping, and that just was never going to make them any kind of profit, and was going to keep them in a perpetual state of poverty. The other group being lots and lots of immigrants, typically from Europe, though from other regions as well. Early on from Northern and Western Europe, England, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, and then later from Eastern and Southern European countries, Austria-Hungary, Greece, Italy, and Russia. This last part we'll talk about specifically next chapter. Like the next chapter is entirely on immigration and how it affected the cities and whatnot. So, where is my mouse? Because I know my online people can't see my little laser pointer. We'll talk about more. Put that aside for now. We'll be discussing the first group for the rest of the chapter. So, here we have various labor unions going out to rallies to make their plights known. Strike called all unions to go out. So, I know you've heard of strikes. That's not something that is unusual for people. However, you may not be familiar with what a strike means. A strike is really like is considered the nuclear option. It's the most extreme thing a worker can do aside from actually like burning down the building. If, for example, you work in a factory and the factory barely pays you and it's dangerous, and you bring your concerns to the supervisor or the boss or whatever, and they don't do anything, you cannot come into work in protest, but then you're just not making any money. But if no one in the factory comes into work, then the factory is not making any money, which is to say they're losing a lot of money. That's what a strike is an organized refusal to work until conditions improve. The most recent high-profile strike was the Writers Union recently, with like it's a very common thing with entertainment where you have the writers and the actors and everything that do the work, but then the company that actually owns the material is the one that makes all the money, and residuals, which is to say whenever it's shown or sold like in stores and stuff, they get that money, and the people who actually made it get paid like the one time, and typically not very much. So yeah, that sort of thing, where they refuse to work, which will cost the company a ton of money, until conditions improve. And a lot of times, I like to compare these to like a medieval siege, because yeah, if they're not working, the company's not making any money, but neither are the workers. So both sides are just kind of staring each other down, waiting on the other to blink. And a lot of times, the only way these strikes succeeded would be if some outside force, like, say, the town they were living in or extended family, would step in and like raise money or give them food, basically keep them alive so they could continue the strike. Otherwise, the big company would typically be able to hold out longer. Or the big company would call in the army to shoot the strikers until they went back to work, which we will see. So anyway, more strikes. International Labor Agency. And again, the thing about these unions, while they were strong, they were only as strong as the amount of people that joined them. Because if, say, again, you've got this factory and only, say, 10% of the workers in the factory are part of a union, then that union's not going to have any pull. They're not going to have enough power to do anything in that factory. So you need more people to join in order for that union to have power. But if you do join a union, they can guarantee you better wages because of the power they're able to wield. Which, again, I'll get more into other union stuff in a little bit. And this is just an illustration of that, where, alone you've only got so much power, but together you're greater than some of your parts, which is just any kind of organizing, not just labor unions. Anyway, there's GE, in case we forgot what GE was about. I can't show like a single product for that because GE is so much stuff, especially nowadays. These are the Pullman Palace cars. These are just like first-class train cars that I have actually a lot of pictures of these because they remind me of like old people's living rooms where everything's got upholstery on it. Like the floor is, of course, entirely carpeted. The walls even have like upholstery on them. All the furniture, it's less cushion and more upholstery. It's just that's how it was. Oh, and also going back to this one, yeah, they've got chandeliers. The tables have like crystal on them. It's like, really, this is what you want in a moving train car? I would prefer a quiet train car. This one seems a little more reasonable. Anyway, and of course, steel here, and then the wave of immigrants. Apparently, I don't have the McCormick Reaper yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. So immigrants coming over in large numbers. Is this yes? So this is the source of immigrants and how it changed over time from the 1800s to, I believe, the late 1900s here. And as you can see, a lot of Germans and Irish. A lot of Germans, in fact. And in the Northeast, lots of Italians and Irish. In the Midwest, lots of Scandinavians. Once we get to that, Swedes, Norwegians. So it wasn't until like the last couple of decades that it was mostly immigrants from Mexico, but mostly these Germans, which again I'll get more into in just a minute. Well, not in just a minute. Next chapter. All right, so as I've said, within the factories themselves, these systems of work underwent significant changes because, again, this wasn't anything like farm labor. Unskilled workers, especially immigrants especially immigrants because they didn't even speak oftentimes the language, had to deal with unfamiliar, unpleasant, and often dangerous industrial work. I mean, I've already shown you guys the textile mills with those just exposed belts, and it was just worse from there. And of course, there was no kind of government benefits. There was no workman's comp, no unemployment insurance. If you lost an arm working, you don't work there anymore, and that's it. If you got killed working, sucks for you. They're going to throw you in a hole. Your family doesn't get any kind of payout. Skilled workers were a little bit better off. They tended to make more money, but they did fight this trend of mechanization because they saw it as not really competition for their job, but taking over their methods of doing things. They owned all their own tools, they worked at their own pace, but because of how things were mechanized, they had to eventually work at the pace of the machines and also make things to the standard of the machines rather than how artisans would do, which is however the hell they want. Which isn't to say like sloppy work, but like they would do things in a way that was like their own signature. Let's see. One mechanist in Lowell, Massachusetts. This is Lowell was full of textile mills, so this was probably a textile mill. He quit after he was told he had to arrive at the opening bell. The doors were locked, and he could not leave until quitting time, which he called a system of slavery, which is an interesting way of putting it. By and large, workers saw an improvement in their economic situation because you did tend to make more money working in factories than you did working a farm because A, you typically didn't make much working a farm anyway, and B, there was a really high chance that there would be a slight economic shift and you'd lose everything. At least with factories, for the most part, you had a fairly stable income. This wasn't always the case, but by and large, you would have a pretty stable income. Now that said, things were not equal. Skilled laborers made more than unskilled laborers. White workers made more than black workers, and men were paid more than women because, again, this is the late 1800s, so obviously. Also, children were put to work. Children yearned for slave wages. Sometimes working nearly 12 hours a day for less than $1 a day. So the days of a father working to support the entire family were over. And this is where I like to just take an aside and mention how the whole like, oh yeah, a father could work and support an entire family in the 1950s and everything was great. That never existed. That was never a thing. Entire families have always had to work. So, FYI, that wasn't something that changed like in the last few decades. That's been a thing since industrialization. So here we have some images. Again, this isn't exactly an assembly line just yet, but it's getting there. It's where each person has a specific thing they do, and then they pass it on to the next person. So this is like early assembly line, but not to the extent that we would see under Henry Ford. Here we are. when I said things got worse than the exposed belts, this is what I meant. This is a pneumatic hammer. This is used to stamp out metal fittings. It's this huge hammer, and I mean by hammer, I mean it's like a big chunk of metal that's just been lifted up by a pneumatic piston here, and it stamps out a little tiny piece of metal, which in this case, these were like helmets for World War I. But so you'd have this whole huge machine putting pressure in one small spot where you would have to put your bare hands. Now, the thing about that, especially this one, it's pneumatic, which means, well, no, it wasn't pneumatic, it was hydraulic. They used water pressure. Point being, if you got caught in all of this, the shut-off button, which would certainly not be within reach of you, so you need to have somebody nearby, it didn't immediately stop the machine like you have in modern machines today. The machine would still have quite a bit of momentum behind it before it would stop. So if you survived, you'd still be in really bad shape. These were extremely dangerous. Yeah, here we go. I also have the Artisans. I believe these are glass blowers based on what we have here and some of the tools they've got, which again is something that typically would be artisanal work, something that you would do by hand, only craftsmen will be able to do, but as the industry is progressing, it's becoming more and more mechanized, and they're losing out on these privileged positions, I guess would probably be the best way to put it. Speaking of children, we have here a very young boy, appears to be shelling oysters. If you're familiar at all with the process of shelling an oyster, the knife he has is very sharp, and the oysters themselves tend to be pretty sharp. So he definitely went home with quite a few scars at the end of the day, especially if you're just doing that all day long. And put the kids in the mines. They don't need lungs. There's mine shafts that are too small to put an adult man in, so send the children. That was literally why children were in mines, because a lot of times the mine shafts would be too small to put an adult man in. So they'd send in either small women or children. And yes, that is coal all over his face, so I imagine his lungs probably don't look too great. But hey, it's the 1800s. Don't worry about it. All right. On to unions. So, to combat all of what we just talked about, to achieve better working conditions and wages, many workers formed unions. However, their employers insisted that they and their workers shared the same interests, and they would set wages and conditions for the workers' best interests, which, like, sure. Obviously, businesses were more than happy to organize to stamp out competition, lobby the government for aid. They saw unions as unlawful and immoral. They refused to negotiate with labor unions, which is known as collective bargaining, which is typically the step you would do before actual strikes, and considered them illegitimate organizations. Now, I don't have the exact details on this, but as far as I'm aware, you can't form a union in a lot of states, including South Carolina. Not necessarily because of stuff here, because of stuff that was done later by, like, Herbert Hoover. But yeah, the only way you can be in a union in states like South Carolina is if you're in a company that already has a union in it, which would be from another state. You can't start one in a lot of these states. So, the first group we're going to talk about is the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, which was founded by Uriah Stevens in 1869. Now, there were other labor unions before this, but this was one of the most successful and was certainly one of the largest. And you can tell by the name, they're going with a lot of like older guild style naming. Terence Powderly became the Grand Master in 1879, pushed for an 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, equal pay for women. They accepted African Americans, immigrants, except for the Chinese, because, and women as members, which made them pretty progressive for the day. They accepted almost everybody except the Chinese, because you got to draw a line somewhere, apparently. Membership exploded. However, there was a rally in Haymarket Square. So to give a little background on that, the book goes into a bit more detail about it. There was, police killed 2 strikers in a clash between union members and strikebreakers. So there was a rally at Haymarket Square to call out this violence against workers. And initially, it went pretty quietly. It had about 1,500 people. By 10:30 p.m., the crowd had dwindled to about 300, so cops came in to break up the crowd. At this point, somebody threw a bomb, and the cops responded by shooting into the crowd. Let's see. When the smoke cleared, 7 policemen and 4 protesters lay dead. Most of the fatalities and injuries resulted not from the bomb, but from police crossfire after the explosion. Because, again, police are really good at shooting civilians and each other, clearly. If you ever actually look into police reports of police getting shot, it's often them shooting each other because they freak out and pull their guns. And clearly that's always been a thing. Subsequent trial convicted 8 anarchists of murder. There was no evidence any of them had actually planted the bomb or used weapons. 4 of them, including August Spies, who was the guy that ran the thing, were executed. Now, all that said, while this was run by anarchists who were not part of the union, the thing that perpetuated the rally did have to do with the union, and therefore it was all tied into the union and therefore sullied the reputation. So by the mid-1890s, the number of members had gone down from nearly 1 million to about 20,000. So the point of all of this is the Haymarket Square rally event thing pretty much broke the back of the Knights of Labor. So this is the Knights of Labor seal. A lot of these early Union seals are horrendous in that you have to turn your head upside down to try to read the whole thing. That is the most perfect government in which injury to one is the concern of all. And here we have the mass meeting for the Haymarket Square. It's also written in German because most of the anarchists were German. This also caused a lot of scrutiny on immigrants because not all immigrants were radicals, but a lot of the radicals were immigrants. So that didn't help. Here is obviously a depiction of what was going on with the bomb going off in the background and the cops responding by just randomly shooting, as one does. Real quick, well, no, actually, hold on. I will get to that in a minute. So, Powder Lane the Knights disavowed using strikes. They felt like it was probably too close to violence because a lot of times strikes would cause violence. The American Federation of Labor typically just went straight to using strikes. However, the AFL was also more discerning with their members. They only employed the most highly paid skilled craftsmen, leaving out women, African Americans, and immigrants. So, just white men that were skilled craftsmen. They were only focused on getting better hours and wages to share in the wealth of industrial capitalism. And by 1900, it had more than 1 million members. So they were still doing well, despite being much more narrow in their membership. Still, though, only 1 in 15 workers actually belonged to a union, due in part to the corporations and the federal government holding so much power. Because if you joined a union, you were basically saying that you were going to fight against the corporations and the federal government. And a lot of workers just didn't want to deal with that. Also, as we've mentioned, the fact that workers were more than just well-paid white men made organization more difficult, racial, cultural, ethnic, and gender divides, causing a lot of trouble with organizing any amount of union cooperation. So here we have the AFL. All goods bearing this label are guaranteed union made. And they really like this whole hands shaking thing. Here we have an anti-union poster. The strike has failed, go back to work. And it's got that in multiple languages, but I don't recognize any of them. This top one is in Cyrillic, so I'm guessing it's Russian. But I would expect one of them to have been in German. And while I can't read German, I can usually recognize German. But I don't know, or at least Italian, but I don't know. I don't recognize any of those up here. And I'm sure if I looked at one of these closer, I might be able to, but they're hard to see. And then here we have, the unskilled labor, $1 a day. Skilled labor is $3 a day. And you've got the business owners, $5,000. The bankers, I suppose, worth 500,000, I want $1 million, and then worth 50 million, I want the earth. So you've got the actual workers who are trying to increase their lot in life by literally a couple of dollars an hour more. And then the big businessmen are like, okay, well, if they can get a couple more dollars an hour, I want to have billions of dollars. And again, back then, that was significantly more, at least in terms of how much it was worth. All right. So, as we mentioned, The strike was the big tool that workers had. Um, Again, companies were allied with the federal government. The federal government was more than happy to work with the companies to really put down workers. Um, but unions could force the hand of these companies by withholding their labor with the strike. And here we have the 1892 Homestead Strike. It's not like the biggest strike, but it's going to be the one we're going to focus on. So, this was the Homestead Strike. This was Homestead, Pennsylvania. This was a factory under Carnegie, so it was a U.S. Steel factory. For the most part, it was not a bad place to work. The workers were paid pretty well, especially if you were a skilled laborer. And, for example, we have John McLuckie, who was the head of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which was a union. And, as we're going to see in a little bit, Carnegie actually worked with the union in the past. However, the price of steel started to drop, which meant that Carnegie wasn't making as much money as he was before. So in order to make up for that, he replaced some of his skilled craftsmen with machinery, cut wages to save on labor costs, and busted McLuckie's union, which again, he had worked with in the past. So it wasn't like this tyrant that was always fighting against the union finally destroyed it. He had been working with the union in the past, and then he stabbed them in the back, which was worse. Now, he knew that all of this would cause a strike, so he went to Scotland on a little vacation. He's Scottish originally, so he went back home to relax, and left his plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, in charge. We've mentioned Frick before, and this is where he shines in the most awful way. Frick was known to be strongly, and I would argue violently, anti-union. So, when the strike happened, Frick had a 3-mile, 15-foot high fence built around 3 sides of the factory, also capped with barbed wire. The 4th side of the factory was bordered by a river, so that worked just fine as a border. And then ordered a lockout on July 1st. Now, again, I'm not super into the details of how all this works. With a strike, you're not coming to work, or you're not working, but typically they would still come to the factory to demonstrate and often keep out strike breakers, which would be people that would be hired to come in and work in their place. A lockout would keep them from being on the property at all. And I guess to prevent them from damaging equipment, because sometimes that would happen as well. Anyway, here is I guess this is like the offices there at the plant, because it was, the map's on the next one. It was a big plant. I've got the map of the whole plant. This is just the start. The lockout is barely worth mentioning because things get crazy. So, Frick was just hanging out in the factory. Everyone was locked out. The town rallied around the workers and kept them housed and fed because, again, a strike is like a siege, and both sides are losing money, but with the town helping the workers, they're able to last longer. So the union had a temporary victory. So on July 6th, Frick hired Pinkerton detectives, which, if you're not familiar with the Pinkertons, they're mercenaries. You hire them to come in and fix problems. And by fixing problems, I mean typically shooting people for you. So they came in barges across the river. McLucky called them a band of cutthroats, thieves, and murderers in the employ of unscrupulous capital for the oppression of honest labor, which is a good way to put it. That said, we're in Pennsylvania in the 1800s, and the Union members were strapped, so they started shooting at the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons, of course, were more than happy to shoot back. However, one of the barges was set on fire, and the Pinkertons were forced to retreat. By the end of this, 3 Pinkertons were left dead, along with 9 strikers. Frick saw that the Pinkertons weren't going to make it, so he called in the local guard, the local state militia. I was going to say National Guard, but state militia, to put down the strike. But while this was happening, Alexander Berkman, an anarchist with no ties to the Union, strolled into Frick's office and shot him in the neck. Frick, however, was merely annoyed by the shot, and as we're going to see in a video before the end of class, proceeded to beat the brakes off of this man, and the anarchist assassination attempt was blamed on the Union. The state also prosecuted the Union, and the strike was broken. McLucky and other Union officials were blacklisted, which meant that they would not be able to work. And if you can't work, you're not going to be able to feed yourself, and you're going to starve because, again, there is no kind of government assistance at this time. You're just out of luck. He fled to Arizona. Carnegie, though, didn't want all this to happen. Sent an anonymous donation, but McLucky refused it because he knew who it was from. Eventually, though, a friend of Carnegie's did get an Arizona railroad to hire McLucky as a machinery repair superintendent, so McLucky at least didn't die in squalor. He managed to have a decent job. But this does show how quickly these strikes can turn violent. Here's the map of the company. So you've got the, I guess, 1, 2, 3 question mark sides of the company, and then the river on the back end, so you don't really need to fence that off. You're not going to have thousands of Union members swimming across the river. And I just threw this in for the Pinkerton agent thing. If you're familiar with Bioshock Infinite, that's what Booker was. That was part of his guilt complex, was that he was just a mercenary for hire. There is Frick sitting on top the factory with it locked out. This looks like a photograph. I don't know if someone managed to get a photograph of one of the barges burning, or if it's just like a really photorealistic painting, which is certainly possible. But yeah, so this is what went down, because they were up on a hill. Again, this is obviously a drawing. But yeah, the Pinkertons came up on barges. The workers were up on the hill, and they weren't having any of it. And they let the Pinkertons know how they felt. And then here we have the state militia coming in to put an end to the strike. There they are there. I don't have a picture of Berkman. Oh, right. A quick word on anarchy. Here we have, let's see, benefit concert for the improvement of the laborer's condition. And then at the bottom, wanted a leader, the labor agitation orchestra for the Go As You Please plan, which is to say, these were a bunch of famous anarchists. And they're being shown in a band that's clearly not getting along. They're running into each other because, by definition, anarchists don't have a leader. Now, if you take like Hollywood's definition of anarchy, it's just like everything's on fire and people are like, again, my brain goes to like Mad Max. Everyone's wearing gimp suits for some reason and throwing Molotovs at each other. That's not what anarchism means. Anarchism is just like a refusal of government, because in the mindset of the anarchist, government can never be for the benefit of the people, because it's always going to oppress its people, no matter how, morally good the government is. It's always going to be negative for the people. So it's like basically returning to small societies taking care of themselves, not just chaotic burning things down. Just FYI, when we talk about anarchists, that's what we mean, not Mad Max, Fallout, Raiders, or whatever. All right, we're going to talk about one more strike, and then I'm going to show you guys that video from the Men Who Built America. Obviously, for you online folks, I can't do that because YouTube will yell at me. So I will post the link for that for you guys on Blackboard. So, real quick, let's talk about the Pullman strike, which I think we briefly talked about before. I'm having a hard time because my Tuesday, Thursday class, is ahead of you guys a little bit. So, no, we did. I mentioned Pullman because we had that picture. Pullman also considered himself a friend to workers, but also when it came to economics, he was a realist. So in 1893, there was a severe depression, which we will get to towards the end of the chapter. So he had to cut wages to continue making a profit. However, as we talked about with that image from before, because of how big his facility was, most of his workers lived on site. So they paid rent to him, the same guy that paid them to work. And when he cut wages, he did not lower rent as well, which I know today is like imagining, a rental place lowering rent because there's an economic downturn. Imagine that. But they did that a lot back then. When people started making less money, the landlords would lower rent a little bit. Obviously not a lot because landlords are monsters. But Pullman did not. Pullman paid people less, but still expected them to pay him the same amount in rent. This resulted in a strike the next year. They belonged to the American Railway Union, headed by Eugene V. Debs, who we will get to because Debs is very important. Believed that organizing labor was a major part of workers' rights. Now, Pullman didn't do like Frick and call in mercenaries first. He decided that since this was a strike against a railway company, sort of, he spoke to President Grover Cleveland's Attorney General Richard Olney and said that the strikers were interfering with the delivery of U.S. mail by train. And let me tell you, nothing gets the U.S. government on board with whatever's going on more quickly than, hey, this can affect the delivery of mail, at least back then, because, whoa, hold on, we got to get involved. The government sent an injunction to Debs and other union officials. They told the federal government where to stick that. So they used the Sherman Antitrust Act to punish those who conspire to restrain trade. The Sherman Antitrust Act that was meant to stop big businesses from forming trusts and running other businesses out of company was used against strikers, workers who were trying to get better working conditions and wages. That's where we're at. Debs refused, was arrested, and sent to jail. However, we will continue to talk about Debs going forward. He later formed the Socialist Party of America, which advocated for a peaceful democratic rise to power as opposed to a violent overthrow of government, which was what would eventually be the Communist Party wanted. That was the split between socialism and communism. Is like they wanted similar goals, workers controlling the means of production, et cetera, et cetera. For socialists, it's go through the system and get the votes. And for communists, it's burn everything down and build it up from the ashes. So, here we have that same image. Pullman with low wages, high rent, squeezing every last penny out of his workers, which of course was going to make things very difficult for the worker to survive. Here we have the Pullman strike, and even the buildings here look ornate. I mean, I showed you guys the palace cars before, but I mean, even where they built the things were a little ostentatious. They set stuff on fire. They were burning these fancy pants train cars. So one of the first orders of the National Guard when they came in was to fight these fires. Here they are coming in on train. Here we have soldiers dispersing the American Railway Union, strikers and sympathizers at 49th Street in Chicago, and by dispersing, I mean shooting into a crowd of civilians. All right, there is one more union to talk about, but we'll do that next time. Let me pull up the video for you guys to see because it's quite good. Not fully accurate because it's a History Channel documentary thing, and they're not always super accurate, but it's definitely worth seeing. And again, for you online folks, I will post the link on Whiteboard, so check that out after you finish this video. All right, see you guys on Monday.